I'm really pleased and humbled that you've all chosen to engage in this grand adventure with us. Many of you have traveled here from far away, from all over the globe, often at your own expense. You've greeted this summit with enthusiasm and with support and commitment, and for that I'm very grateful. The response, as reinforced in the minds of those of us who have been working on this summit for so long, that this is the right thing to do at the right moment. So I want to thank all of you, first of all, the delegates who've come here from different countries and different parts of this country, for your generosity of spirit and for your willingness to try something a little different. I first approached Art Kaplan, who's on our distinguished faculty here, with this idea over a decade ago, and we did begin at the University of Pennsylvania to think about this and even began to plan it a little bit. And at the time, the hot topics were things like reproductive versus therapeutic cloning and the use of embryonic stem cells. But people seemed to be talking past each other a lot and trying to score points more than they were trying to really reach some deep and abiding understanding of different positions and work past them. It seemed at the time that a gathering of thought leaders might go far towards trying to engage in a more serious and difficult discussion of the value issues at the heart of their disagreements. Well, if a summit like Being's seemed valuable a decade ago, it's even more valuable now. In fact, now it seems imperative. Scientists, including some of you in this very room, are able to manipulate now the very plasms of life in unprecedented ways. The potential value and the deep possibilities behind that science are thrilling, but also deeply challenging. And it's appropriate that we are doing it now because we seem to have come full circle. It was 40 years ago this February when Paul Berg and 150 or so of his colleagues gathered together at Asilomar in California to discuss recombinant DNA technology. The Asilomar guidelines to establish the standards for that work for decades after that, and in fact, those guidelines still resonate through our science policy today. And just last month, a paper in Science by that same Paul Berg, having since won a Nobel Prize and now in his late 80s, along with our own George Church and other scientists like David Baltimore and Jennifer Doudna, and even some bioethicists like Alta Charo and Hank Greeley, again called for caution about a genetic technology. This time it was CRISPR, a genetic engineering technology whose simplicity will actually make genomic editing available to researchers with some knowledge of molecular biology all over the globe. It will democratize, in a sense, these techniques that had before this been able to be done only by a small group of very highly specialized scientists. But the situation is very different now than it was in 1975. First of all, Asilomar gathered virtually all the scientists of the day who could actually do this work. Tools like CRISPR and other technologies are becoming so accessible that we're now beginning to talk about and worry about and think about do-it-yourself genomic manipulation. People who are doing these kinds of genetic editing technologies, not in the major labs, but in smaller venues and, in a sense, in their backyards. High school students in labs today engage in experiments around genetics that were unachievable by major scientists just a decade or two ago. A second big difference is the biotechnology industry in the 1970s was a handful of companies. Today, the North American biotech business has more than 1,300 companies with market capitalization in the hundreds of billions. There are hundreds of thousands of workers in the United States alone working in major biotech companies. Amgen's profits in 2014 were $18.7 billion. Biotech is projected to continue that great, steep growth curve for the foreseeable future. Biotech is becoming a kind of large industrial juggernaut whose direction it may be very hard to help guide or shape in the future, very hard to influence. But finally, and most importantly, I think, we are now at that promising, dangerous, liminal moment where our tools are powerful enough to tempt us to use them to try to achieve things, good things, things we want, things of value. But our knowledge is limited enough that I don't know how good we are at predicting the potential harms that those technologies could cause. When it comes to DNA, we're still more mechanics than engineers or theoreticians. While we're getting better at making things work, we're still not quite sure how they work. And in that tension lies real challenges for those of us who believe in the potential of biotechnology. When the article in Science came out about CRISPR, the media widely reported that the article called for a moratorium. In fact, while it did suggest that we discourage and that countries discourage germline genetic modification, the word moratorium was not used. The main call of that article, and this was missed by a lot of people in the media, the main call of that article was, and I'm going to quote here, to begin a discussion that bridges the research community, relevant industries, medical centers, regulatory bodies, and the public to explore responsible uses of this technology. And that is why we're all here, to begin a first stage in that conversation. And while the people in this room certainly don't represent the general public, most of you are experts in your fields, we do have a unique opportunity to become a model, to become a kind of first try at that bigger conversation, and to offer the rest of the conversations that follow a powerful, thoughtful, and inclusive foundational manuscript to work from. The conversation won't be easy. There are competing voices here and differing values. We were very intentional about inviting people with a spectrum of views on biotechnology to beings. There are those in our community who believe deeply that we're moving forward with technologies in haste, without due deliberation, and that in our excitement we could make a catastrophic error. On the other side, we have those who argue that biotechnology's potential to reduce and relieve human suffering make development a moral imperative, and suggest that with all of the work that goes into testing and the care that goes into biotechnology, some people are being overcautious. In our midst, we have those who believe that biotechnology operates within a corporate frame that is inherently self-serving and exploitative, interested primarily in profiteering, and those who see in the biotech sector scientists and entrepreneurs deeply committed to healing, to wanting to cure, and using the most efficient means we have at our disposal to develop those technologies for the benefit of all. And of course, to some degree, all of those arguments are true and right. Our goal at Beings is to move beyond the limitations of those arguments and engage in some deep, thoughtful self-examination, and also some careful listening to other sides. We need to ask ourselves about how sides are framing their arguments. We need to ask if some of the arguments about transgenic animals and other genetic technologies don't rest on a false assumption that moving genes from one species to another is unnatural or crosses a barrier we should not cross. There really are no such things as animal genes or plant genes or even fungi genes. We all share a large part of our genomes with animals and plants and other living things. And species barriers are naturally genetically porous. Genes transfer fairly often. Chunks of viral and bacterial DNA move around a lot. Our own genomes, as we all know, are filled with those kinds of borrowings from other species. And let's not forget that human beings have been genetically altering creatures on this earth for as long as we've been around, for millennia. There is not a single vegetable that we eat that looks anything like that vegetable looked when human beings first got their hands on them. And, of course, I won't even start in on that most human of genetic manipulations, our dogs. Right? I mean, dogs are an unnatural creature that we have created all by ourselves. But on the other hand, the argument that expressing deep concern about such technologies is a kind of Luddism, or that believing that we need to consider the dignity and integrity of the human condition is muddled thinking around science, or that science and scientific progress is just to be trusted, we will make sure that harms don't come to us, are equally misguided. The history of science's belief in its own objectivity and lack of bias around these things is not all that convincing and has led to some great human suffering. Science is a human activity embedded in social relationships and structures informed by and reflecting the cultural beliefs and priorities of its surrounding society. The bottom line is this: ethics teaches us that there is a strong moral dimension to the actions that we take in this world, to the priorities we express, to the kinds of interventions in the natural world that we decide are acceptable and unacceptable. There's a moral dimension expressed in the kinds of questions that society asks of science and in the types of solutions science offers back to us in society. And that moral dimension needs to be made explicit, discussed, debated, and integrated into our views of the future of biotechnology. When we're talking about a technology as powerful as genetic technology, we have a moral imperative to ask some deeper questions of what values those manipulations are in service of and whether those are the right ones. I think there's a deep misunderstanding that many of us have in the modern world. Because of the extraordinary advances we've made in science, we've come to believe that progress is itself a value. And insofar as progress has value, it's certainly not ultimate value. Technological advance has to be in service of larger human concerns, and the problems that face the modern world are complex and multifaceted. Technology is a tool in the solution to those problems, but it has to be in service of the values that define its use. And so I ask us to move past the kind of biotechnological utopianism and also a perspective that seems to fear and be suspicious of science itself. Both I think of as equally parochial. We must look at our science with eyes wide open, seeing it as a grand human enterprise embedded in a rich history of culture and value. And that is why Beings was conceived, and that is why I hope we are all here today. And that is also why we're going to begin our conversation today, and will continue over the next months as this document is prepared, with the foundational questions of the nature of progress and the purpose of biotechnology. One of the differences, I hope, between Beings and other such efforts that have been made in the past is that we're going to start discussing our aspirations, to ask, what are our goals for biotechnology? What is it in service of? How can it contribute to human flourishing? Do we actually each think of those goals in the same way? Do we actually each think that the aspirations we have for biotechnology lead us to the same place? Let's not take it for granted that we do. I think we often do take that for granted. And how can we best use the insights that come from this incredibly diverse community that sits here today? We have delegates here from philosophy and art, science and literature, sociology and law, religion and biology. We have delegates here who are postdocs and delegates here who are deans of departments and directors of institutes, all from over 20 different countries just sitting right here. We may be amongst the most diverse groups ever gathered with the goal of writing a unified set of ethical principles and policy standards for biotechnology. How can we use those resources that we have in front of us to create a deeper exploration of why we engage in this enterprise, of the values and interests we serve? How might we assure that these powerful tools of what is really, I believe, the next phase of human development are used in ways that are just a little more fair, a little more equitable, and a little more compassionate? One of the main tenets of Beings from its start was our commitment to assuring that all perspectives, including minority and dissenting opinions, are heard and represented in the final declaration that we create. If we cannot reach consensus on a principle or standard, we will write a document that reflects the disagreement around that particular issue, allowing both sides voice in their perspectives. Like Supreme Court decisions where dissenting opinions are filed, but even more so, drawing from my own tradition, like the Talmud, which was the first document in human history to record all opinions before the final opinion was rendered. We want to have a rich conversation, even in what we're calling the consensus document, of all of the perspectives that led up to the final decisions. I believe that that kind of richness enhances, not diminishes, the final statement that we make. And it allows voices that are sometimes silenced to be heard. And to that end, we've carefully designed a process for Beings that will help us talk together, write together, collaborate, and ultimately to create a consensus document that we hope all will share in and endorse. And for that, I particularly want to thank Karen Rommelfanger, who has been extraordinary in helping to design the process that those of you, especially the drafting delegates, will go through and be part of over the next few days and then over the next months. So I want to turn my attention now to discussing how this is going to work and what the process is of Beings as we move forward. First, I want to talk about the scope. What are we including and what are we not including? Of course, we can't write a document that is some kind of a consensus document about all of biotechnology. The field is too vast and diverse for that. So we're going to focus on a few areas, and I want to make really clear what the boundaries are of the focus of Beings so that we can keep our comments and our thoughts as much within those boundaries. The boundaries are porous. We will overlap these boundaries, but this is the focus of what Beings is about. So, what Beings is going to concentrate on is concerned with basic science and some translational science around technologies that either first directly manipulate human cells and cell lines or manipulate the cells of other creatures such that it might have a fairly direct impact on human beings or the human condition. And so to try to capture that, I've been using the term human cellular biotechnologies, a term that has no real purchase in the world, but it sort of captures that idea that we're really concerned about the impact on human beings for this particular purpose. Stem cell technology, synthetic biology, genetic manipulations of cells like CRISPR, those are our paradigmatic examples of the kinds of technologies that we're going to think about most at Beings. So I want to say a word about what we're not going to include, very intentionally. We'll not be discussing agribusiness, GMO crops, or food. That will not be a part of the Beings consensus document. We will need to talk about animals and animal cell lines to some extent, but we will not be talking about animal rights or animal protections as research subjects. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we're not going to be discussing clinical research or medicine. We won't include first-in-human experimentation or informed consent for clinical trials. We will discuss informed consent because we are going to talk about tissue donations and things like that. But I like to say beings is going to stop at the clinic door and only include, therefore, part of translational science work. And the reason for these boundaries is simply they each take us in a direction that would, first of all, spin us off into conversations that would take far longer than we have time for. The issues of human research subjects in clinical medicine have their own very, very long history and set of ethical precepts that all of us in bioethics spend an enormous amount of time on. But I wanted us to focus on these technologies as technologies. Other of these issues will undoubtedly come up. They're not taboo. It's just I don't want them to be the focus of what we talk about, and I don't want the final document to spend a lot of time thinking about them. Perhaps Beings 2 can take up some of those, and if one of you want to organize that, please be my guest. I'll be somewhere else. And one other thing I want to say about this, even though in some sense I'm already making an ideological point by saying this, and some of you may disagree, but I also include embryonic research as part of our purview. So that includes germline, genetic alteration, and things like that, even though for some of you that may be stepping into an area that you think about as human clinical experimentation. So, we've divided beings into 5 main topic areas, and the way we came up with these topic areas was by polling the delegates. All of you should have gotten emails and sent in what you think some of the main issues are. We read through all of them, and we tried to group them into 5 topic areas so that we can actually conveniently talk about them. And again, these areas are also somewhat porous, so as we talk about particular areas, issues from the other areas will come up. But this is just an organizational scheme to allow us to talk about these things in discrete chunks. The 5 are aspirations and goals. That'll be our first session. The next one is alien organisms and new, and there we did a clever little word trick with entities and putting idea in front of it. So both the nature of identity and entities. Bioerror and bioterror, ownership, donorship, and then in addition some cross-cutting issues like evaluating risk and harms and who should regulate. There are also 5 guiding questions that we hope will go through the entire conference. They're in your programs. I'm not going to read them to you. There will also be a session where we focus on those questions. So who are we at Beings? We're made up of a few discrete groups of people. First are our distinguished faculty. I'm deeply grateful to each of them for agreeing to join us. It is not because of the opportunity to visit Atlanta or because of the extremely modest honorarium we offered them that they came and took time out of their busy lives to come and talk to us. It's because I believe they also saw the importance of what we're trying to do here and the kind of conversation we're trying to initiate. I've asked the distinguished faculty to keep their comments very brief and to ask provocative questions to stimulate the conversation. I have great thanks to my distinguished faculty for their generosity in coming here. Then there are the delegates, and we have 3 types. First are the drafting delegates. They're the ones that have volunteered to help draft the consensus document, and they'll be working in their 5 topic areas over the next 8 months or so to craft a set of ethical principles and policy standards. And I am extremely grateful for those of you who are doing that. I had hoped that we might have 15 or 20 people who are willing to sit and work on this. 80 drafting delegates volunteered to work on this, and that's was far beyond what I ever thought we would get. Thank you. Then we have non-drafting delegates, and they split into 2 groups. One are non-drafting delegates who agreed to be reviewers and editors of the final document, and so as drafts come in, we'll be sending it out to you, and thank you for taking that role. And then finally, non-drafting delegate attendees are those who are participating in this summit over the next few days and will primarily contribute during this summit with critiques, ideas, points that should be considered that we will collect. So, how will all of this go? We've packed a lot into Being's agenda, so we're going to try to stick as closely as possible to schedule. So excuse me for the tight time management we're going to try to use here. Each of the 5 topic areas will begin with a short presentation by the distinguished faculty. And then we are going to have a panel discussion. The distinguished faculty will be joined by a few other, speakers will be joined by a few other distinguished faculty, and we will have a panel conversation. Then the panel will leave the stage, and that will be your opportunity to make comments. We have 2 mics here, and I'll ask you to come up to the mics to make your comment. But we're going to do this a little differently. On your table are cards. The cards are designated by topic area, A, B, C, D, and E, which is in your program. Before you come up to make a comment, and in fact throughout the summit, if you have a point you want to make or an idea, a criticism, something that needs to be considered, something that needs to be added, an ethical principle or priority about a topic area, please put it on the appropriate topic card, and we have staff that will come and collect these. If you want to come up to the mic during the comment period, please write down your comment, the main point of your comment, on your card, come up to the mic, make it, and then hand your card to the staff member who will be there. We're going to keep comments at the mic short, 90 seconds or so to 2 minutes, no more than that, so that we can get as many voices as possible. So what we're going to ask you to do at the mic is ask a question, make a point, create a critique in a very brief fashion. Sitting in the front row here on the tables with letters on them are what we call the theme teams. Theme teams are made up of the 2 topic area leaders and then what are scribes, those mostly graduate students and some other people on both sides of graduate students who have agreed to sit and take notes throughout the summit as people make points, to collect these cards, and to try to begin to create some coherence out of what you all say in each of the topic areas. We have many ways for you to submit your comments. I talked about the topic cards. We also have a Twitter feed, and we will be flashing the hashtags during the topics so that you can actually tweet to the topic area that's being discussed. All of those Twitter comments will be also captured. So if you have a quick thing you want to say, you can put it on a card. You can tweet it. We also have a Dropbox, and all of you should have been sent information about the Dropbox, so any documents you have, you can drop in the Dropbox. One caveat for the delegates, please note that we have a lot of media here from major media outlets. They will be hearing what you say at the mics, so if there is something that you say that you think you would prefer to sort of privately transmit to any of the topic area writers or to other drafting delegates, that's the time to use a card and hand it to our staff. Those cards will be collected but will not be publicly read. Tomorrow, we'll continue in the morning with a similar strategy, and then everything changes at lunch when our distinguished faculty leave, and we really begin to work on the process of writing this, and tomorrow I'll talk about that. You should have a full program guide. Delegates will have gotten a USB. On the USB is all of the materials that are in your program guide, plus hundreds of articles from all over the world, organized into international categories and by-country categories, talking that are regulations, are ethical principles by committees, all kinds of resources from all over the world. The one caveat is they are only in English. And so regulations or ethical principles or things that were generated by countries in language other than English did not make it into that group. It was a decision we made, and I apologize to those countries where almost all of their materials were in a language other than English. They were not included. There is a Wi-Fi that those of you who have computers, it's Bing's 2015. It should be freely available. There's no password to you. And one last thing to say before we move on, and that is please watch your step. Because of this old, wonderful venue, we had to tape a lot of cables on the floor so that you could have electricity. Please be very careful. It's very easy to trip here. Everything's taped down, but just keep your eyes open as you move around the venue, please. Before we move on, I just want to quickly thank our sponsors of this conference. We couldn't have done it without them. Most of all, I want to thank our premier sponsor, the Coca-Cola Company, for giving us the generous seed grant that allowed all of this to happen. We're flashing our sponsors' logos. Please take a look at them. You know, sometimes we take our sponsors for granted. We did not take our sponsors for granted. And I'm really sincere in thanking not only our premier sponsors, but our gold, silver, bronze, contributing sponsors, everybody who gave some resources so that we could make this happen. We have corporate sponsors you see there, but we also have partners that include 14 Georgia-based universities, many of whom gave generously. You'll see their names in the literature as well. Please take a look at that. Others who gave in-kind contributions. We have a series of anonymous donors who gave and didn't even want to be acknowledged. And I would just like to take a moment to sincerely thank them, and I'll ask you to thank them as well, because we wouldn't be here without them. So. A few other quick thank yous. There's a strategic advisory board whose names are in your program, who helped us from the beginning, that included Atlanta City-based people, university-based people. A special thank you out to Georgia Tech, who's been a very strong partner with us in this, and Bob Narum, the head of the bioengineering program there, who's been an advisor and a supporter of Beings. So thanks to the Strategic Advisory Board, who has helped us along the way. Please take a look at their names in your program. And finally, but in some ways not least, in fact, perhaps most, the unbelievable staff of the Center for Ethics at Emory University, who did all of this and have been working on this literally for years, and has organized these days, helped us create this beautiful venue along with Q&A events, which has put together the physical look of all of this, and Jessica Schwartz from Emory, who is our conference coordinator. Could we please give them a thank you, a sincere thank you for all of this. In her book, Cat's Eye, our distinguished faculty member, Margaret Atwood, in her dedication, quotes a line from Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And in it, he says, "Why can we remember the past but not the future?" And I think what we're going to try to do here over the next couple of days and into the next few months is see if we can somehow remember the future that is still to come, and see if maybe just with a little bit of work we can help shape that memory into something that we live into in a way that benefits and enriches all of us.